Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We are starting a little late because some of our colleagues were not able to join us on time due to the queues at the entrance. And the number of people that we have in the room is quite low. But I think we have to start the conversations. It's a very important topic that we'll be talking about. So we, instead of following the initial idea of having an opening by our executive secretary, we thought we'd rather, follow this as conduct this as more of an informal conversation amongst us. So we did not see the need for an opening, so we'll go straight to the presentation. So this is a very important piece of work that we are sharing with you today. At the Africa Trade Policy Center within the ECA, we spent a lot of our time and our energy around the African Continental Free Trade Area, often looking at the trade dimensions of it properly, but gradually, increasingly, we are also looking at the other issues, climate change being, of course, the most important issue that we are considering right now. So Simon, my colleague here, Dr. Simon Mabel, has been leading the technical work. So I'm about to invite Simon to give us a presentation. And then this will be followed up with interventions, a panel discussion made up of my three distinguished colleagues here who have made it from different parts of the world. And I would like to thank all of you for making it. Jide, Rashid, and Fatan. These are leading experts in their own fields, and we're delighted to have them. Simon, I will give you about 20 minutes to make your presentation. And then hopefully, if you can speed it up, we can even save time for discussions. And we'll try to finish it still by around 10:30. Thank you very much. Simon, please.
Thank you, Melaku. Good morning, everyone. I'll be short. I'll try to do it within the 20 minutes and even less if I can. This is a study that we have undertaken at ECA in collaboration with CEPI. CEPI, it's the Centre d'études prospectives et d'information internationale. It's a research center which is well known for its data and modeling work. I also want to acknowledge the financial contribution from the government of Denmark, without whom the work would not have been possible. So the title of the study is Greening the AFCFTA Agreement's Implementation. And what I will do, I will go straight into the main findings of the study. So we have 5 key findings in the study. The first one is a demonstration that if we implement the AFCFTA agreement, that can boost intra-African trade without having a significant negative impact on climate change. The second finding shows that in parallel of implementing the AFCFTA, if African countries also adopt climate policies, we looked at the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, we also look at carbon market instruments, and we see that adopting them on top of the implementation of the AFCFTA would actually help substantially reducing Africa's greenhouse gases emissions. Third, we see that there is a trade-off between reducing greenhouse gases emission and enhancing the economic benefits. However, we also see that pricing Africa's carbon would be both an effective and efficient way for Africa to meet its climate objective in line with the NDCs. The fourth findings reveal that continental coordination around carbon pricing can deliver better outcomes. And finally, meeting Africa's climate objective can also accelerate Africa's transition to renewables. So these are the 5 key findings. I will illustrate them with empirical evidence shortly in a minute. But before, just in case anyone is not well aware of the AFCFTA agreements and where we stand, just a brief recap on the situation. So the negotiations officially started in June 2015. They are conducted in 2 phases. The first phase of the negotiation is largely completed and had to do with 3 main issues: trade in goods, trade in services, and a dispute settlement mechanism. A second phase is ongoing, which has been added later, and that has to do with 5 main issues. The first 3 issues that you see here, investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy, the negotiations are completed, but the protocol still remains to be operationalized. And then the last 2 issues, last 2 protocols on digital trade, and then a protocol also on women and youth in trade. Negotiations are still ongoing, but we are nearing the conclusion of the negotiations for both protocols. Just to mention that the trading under the AFCFTA was supposed to begin officially on the 1st of January 2021, but in fact, it's only after October 2022, when the AFCFTA Secretariat launched the Guided Trade Initiative, that trade effectively took place on the ground under the AFCFTA agreement. This is the situation in terms of the signing and the ratification of the agreement. So we only have 1 country that has not signed the agreement, that is Eritrea. Another 7 countries that have signed the agreement but did not ratify it yet. And the rest of the member states all signed and ratified the agreement. At ECA, we have developed a small booklet with questions and answers about what you need to know on the AFCFTA, and of course you can access it online if you are interested. So now, before I really present the key findings of the analysis, I just wanted to give a few words on the methodology very briefly, without getting into the technical details, of course, and the scenarios that we have considered for the analysis. In terms of the methodology, we use the so-called computable general equilibrium, so a CG model. The advantage of such model is that it allows to capture interactions between and within countries and between and within sectors. So it's quite powerful at assessing complex policies like the AFCFTA that impact a number of countries and a number of sectors. When it comes to the scenario, we first implemented the AFCFTA agreement. For that, we considered the agreed AFCFTA modalities on trade in goods, and we also undertook a reduction of non-tariff measures both in goods and in the priority services sectors. On top of the AFCFTA, and this is particularly important here, we have implemented a number of climate policies. So the starting point for us is the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, from the Paris Agreement. And what it's important to say here is that all African countries, except Libya, have submitted their nationally determined contributions. In addition, it's also critical to understand how the NDCs work. They can be either unconditional, so 100% unconditional, meaning that the country has fully committed to fulfill them through its own domestic resources. In Africa, we only have 1 country in that situation. This is South Africa. Or they can be conditional. Conditional to what? Conditional to international support. You have 4 countries in Africa that have 100% conditional NDCs: Egypt, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. And all the rest, so most of the countries, have both conditional and unconditional elements in their NDCs. And in fact, there is a huge funding gap because if you look at the total needs for fulfilling the NDCs, 90% of the total to fulfill Africa's NDCs is conditional to international support. And so here you have the example of Kenya, which is a good example of the country average in Africa. where in Kenya, for instance, 13% of the NDCs of Kenya are supposed to be unconditional, to be met by its own financial resources, and the bulk of it, 87%, is subject to international support that Kenya could receive to implement its NDCs. We have considered 4 scenarios when it comes to the climate policy. The first 3 scenarios have to do with the NDCs and based on their level of ambition. So if you look at the yellow circle here, this is what we could call a low ambition scenario, where we assume that 100% of the unconditional targets are going to be met. So if you look at Kenya, for example, that's the 13% blue area on the pie chart of Kenya that we assume to be realized only. Then we have a medium ambition scenario, that is the orange circle here, where we, in addition of the unconditional target, we assume that 1/4 of the conditional ones could be met. And then the high ambition scenario that we consider, it's 100% of unconditional target plus 50% of the conditional one. We don't go up to 100%. There are 2 reasons for that. The first one is that because of the large share of international support required, it's very unlikely that it will materialize. And second, you will see from the result that already the high ambition scenario that we consider, it's something that is very costly. Then we consider a 4th scenario, and for that we take a different approach because it relies on carbon pricing. And here what we do, we test a proposal by the IMF, the International Carbon Price Floor proposal, where they suggest 3 prices. One price of $25 per ton of carbon for the low-income countries, $50 for middle-income countries, and $75 for high-income countries. For Africa, what we decided to test here, it's the $25 carbon price because most of the African countries are low-income countries. Again, it doesn't mean that this is the ideal price. It's just testing the hypothesis to see if it delivers better, the same, or worse outcome than the NDC scenarios. Now I'm going to unpack the key messages that I presented at the beginning, going in order one by one in just a few minutes. If you recall the first key messages, what we were saying is that with the implementation of the AFCFTA, the intra-African trade could increase substantially. Here we find that intra-African trade could be 35% higher following implementation of the AFCFTA in 2045 than as compared to a situation in absence of the AFCFTA. Despite this large increase in intra-African trade, we see that the impact on GHG emission, it's positive, but it's very limited, less than 1%. Here it should be noted that we are looking at greenhouse gases emission, both CO2 and non-CO2 combined. And there are 4 reasons that we found in the study to explain such a low level of increase in GHG emission following AFCFTA implementation. The first one is that, of course, intra-African trade will increase substantially, but that will be from a very low base. You know that today, or let's say in 2020, the share of intra-African trade was only 15%. We are only looking at formal intra-African trade. We are not able here to model the informality of intra-African trade, which could be much larger. And what we foresee is that in 2045, even if the AFCFTA was not to be implemented, the share of intra-African trade will increase and be around 19%. And this is logical because the population will increase, the demand will increase, production and ultimately export within the continent will increase even if the AFCFTA is not in place. And then if the AFCFTA was to be implemented in 2045, we assess the share to be about 24%. So it's a substantial increase, but it's only 5 percentage points more than in absence of the AFCFTA. And so this doesn't push substantially the emissions very, very strongly. The second reason is as Africa is trading more with itself in the situation of the AFCFTA, it will also trade less with the rest of the world. So there is net creation, but again, the burden on the greenhouse gases emission is not so high with that positive and negative effect, which overall is positive, but still not extremely large. The third reason is the fact that we foresee that the share of CO2 emission, Africa's CO2 emission in 2045 would only be 25% of the total emissions, GHG emissions for Africa. And in fact, with the AFCFTA, the CO2 emissions are the emissions that will increase the most, largely through increased transportation using fossil fuels. And that means that the share of the increase of CO2 would again be from a small base, limiting the overall increase of greenhouse gases emission from Africa. And then the last reason is that we find that in most sectors the emissions would increase, but we do have energy-intensive, emission-intensive sectors where actually emissions would decrease when we implement the AFCFTA. This is the case of livestock, for example, which is a very important sector in Africa. Now moving to the climate policy results, climate policy scenarios. What we do here is that in parallel to the AFCFTA, we implement, as I was indicated at the beginning, either the nationally determined contributions, 3 level of ambition scenarios, or a carbon pricing scenario. And if you look at the first 3 bars, the NDC scenario, the yellow, the orange, and the red bars, we see that indeed the higher the ambition, the higher the reduction in greenhouse gases emission, but also the lower the increase in intra-African trade. So there is a trade-off again between reducing emission and increasing economic benefits. In the study, we look at other economic variables that I am not showing here, for example, GDP, and we see that in the most ambitious scenario of the indices, Africa's GDP would actually decrease. And so here, the carbon pricing scenario is quite interesting because it provides the largest decrease in greenhouse gases emission, and it preserves the intra-African trade gains quite well. And GDP, for instance, would also still be significantly increasing following carbon pricing. Now, what we are doing here, we computed the cost of avoiding 1 ton of carbon to assess the efficiency of the various reforms. With NDC scenarios, again, the first 3 bars, you can see that as the ambition increases, of course, the cost is going to increase. And in the most ambitious scenario, the cost will be very high. It would cost about $46 to avoid 1 ton of carbon implementing an ambition NDC scenario. And so I was saying at the beginning, we didn't implement 100% of the conditional plus and conditional target, because you can see that if we would have done that, you would easily have a price of $70 or $80 to avoid 1 ton of carbon, which is prohibitive. In the case of the carbon pricing, again, it's very interesting. With a $25 uniform carbon price across Africa, the cost will be much lower, around $26 to avoid 1 ton of carbon. So here, we saw earlier that the carbon price is quite effective at reducing greenhouse gases emission, and it's also very efficient because it tends to cost, but not so much to actually reduce emissions on the continent. Then, we, of course, have just seen that a uniform carbon price across Africa can be both effective and efficient. But if African countries were to adopt different carbon price, then it could also be quite efficient only if they adopt a coordination around carbon pricing. So here what we do is that we set the same objective in terms of greenhouse gases emission than in the 25 carbon price scenario, which was a decrease of 24.5% of greenhouse gases emission. And we assume that the ones who emit more will pay more, but in a proportional way. So for instance, let's say in 2045, a country that is emitting 10% of the total Africa's emission will contribute 10% of the effort to reduce the greenhouse gases emission to reach the target that we set around a reduction around 25%. And so the result here is quite interesting. Of course, the same if we compare the 25 uniform carbon price and a carbon price that vary across countries, but in a coordinated way, there will be the same reduction in greenhouse gases emission, which is obvious because that's our target. The intra-African trade will increase about the same, but the cost could actually even be reduced further. $19 to avoid 1 ton of carbon, in that case, against around $26 in the uniform carbon price. This graph here compares the implicit carbon prices across countries and across all the scenarios. So you see huge variability across countries and across scenarios. And this essentially shows that there is a huge variability in terms of the design and the ambition of the NDCs across the African countries. So if we compare with the green line, which is here our benchmark on this graph, which is the $25 carbon price, and if you just look at the red bars, the ambition NDC, most ambitious NDC scenarios, and the blue bar, you see that there is variability in both cases, but the variability on average is much lower with the blue bars, which is a coordinated approach for carbon pricing. And so again, that reinforces the importance for coordination when it comes to climate policies on the continent. And it also illustrates that the NDCs have not been designed in a coordinated way, and that makes them less efficient compared to carbon pricing. And so just to finish, we see here on the last slide that Africa is on path for towards the renewable transition to green technology. A lot of countries like Ethiopia have already adopted green technology to produce electricity. Today, the share is about 25%, and we foresee that without the AFCFTA, without climate policy, it's on the way to double by 2045. But if you implement the climate policy in parallel, then that will accelerate the move towards green technologies on the continent. And again, here the blue bar is where you have the largest impact, which is a carbon pricing coordinated approach. So coordination, again, is very important to get the best outcome from the carbon pricing. So I don't think I need to recap the key findings that I mentioned at the beginning. And I should rather thank you for your attention.
The presentation is gone now, I think. Simo, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I think you can see how profound some of the findings are. We are effectively saying here, with the right mix of approaches and policy choices, we can implement the FCFTA and reap all the benefits of the single market, the huge market that we are trying to create through the FCFTA, without necessarily impacting on the climate, meaning without causing too much greenhouse gas emissions, that would be detrimental to our own sustainable development. And I think the kind of approaches that have been used in this study, they tell you the extent, to which we have gone in making sure that most of the key, the possibilities are taken into account. NDCs that are conditional, NDCs that are unconditional, the carbon price, and etc. Yesterday we had a meeting with the Director General of the WTO here. And one of the issues that came up was, look, we see that different institutions are coming up with their own carbon pricing methodologies. And the WTO Director General wanted to start a conversation, a process by which different institutions can come together and come up with what she called a comprehensive methodology on how to price carbon globally. And now you have seen the kind of choice that we have taken in our work, and the results, I believe, are extremely interesting. So, and to comment on this, we have got a lineup of colleagues who come with different perspectives, with different backgrounds. I will, in the spirit of the informality that I tried to achieve, I'm not going to use a note to introduce my colleagues here, but I will ask each of you to introduce yourselves briefly. But I thought I would first ask you to respond to the presentation and especially the findings. Earlier I was trying to put the findings on, yes, I think they are here. Okay? So you can look at these findings in front of us here. And they're very profound with significant policy implications. So I thought I would first ask you to comment on the way the research, the findings are striking a balance between our trade-led development interests and our commitment to make sure that we are not going to follow the dirty line of development like all other countries in other parts of the world have done. So let me start with you. Maybe, who do I start with? With Faten. Let me start with you. You can start by introducing yourself briefly, and you can tell us your immediate reactions in the next 2 minutes. Thank you very much. You can come here if you don't have a speaker. Yeah, okay, thank you. No? Maybe you can come here?
1, 2, 3, yeah, perfect, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Milako. Thanks, Simon, for the presentation. I've been asked to quickly introduce myself, so I'm Faten Agad. I'm currently it's quite a mouthful, a member of the a high-level African group of experts on the reforms of the multilateral system. And that's a group of African experts currently supporting the Foreign Affairs Minister of Namibia, particularly prepare as co-chairs for the Summit for the Future. But until just recently, I was an advisor to the African Climate Foundation, working very much on these issues, and prior to that, as a also senior advisor on the negotiations that African countries were heading with the were leading with the European Union, where these issues also came up, and particularly around the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so a lot of my reflections will be informed by, by that experience and some of the work that I've done. I think what Simon and this ECA study has put before us is a very difficult nut to crack. And what I mean by that is that we are increasingly seeing that African economies are even more exposed, and the risk of exposure to external shocks because of regulated carbon markets is there. And in fact, it's just starting because of the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. But I think we should expect it to expand even more because of the work that's going on in China, for instance, and countries such as India that's also coming up with a regulated market with the UK, and most likely generally moving towards a G7 harmonized approach, but also several members of the G20 with which we are trading. And so in their case, it's very much a regulated carbon market where a price is traded But it's not voluntary in the sense that, which is what we have currently in some of the African countries, where we have a very kind of low carbon price at around $5 per ton. And so this vulnerability has put a very challenging situation on our table. And the question is, can the CFTA help us tackle that? It's perhaps very specifically on some of the suggestions made by the study. Learning also from the experience, particularly of countries such as South Africa, which has attempted to introduce kind of a harmonized carbon price for very few sectors. So I think what would be useful also is to understand, is the $25 per ton across sectors, or is it a selection of sectors? And in which case, what does it do then with the transition? But in the case of South Africa, which is so far, I believe, the only African country that has experimented with this, it hasn't been a smooth ride. And the price is much lower, I believe at around $12 a ton. What we have seen in that particular situation is that the private sector and the industries were extremely nervous because of competitiveness issues. And I think in any kind of modeling, I think that dimension, there is an environmental aspect, naturally, but I think we need to look at the balance and strike the right balance. I'll try to shout louder. and strike the right balance between the climate gains and the impact on the industry. And try to balance that. And I think the question is, would a $25 per ton price not be undermining the industrial base, frankly, the weak industrial base that we currently have? Or should we be much more selective and say, we will rather align those sectors to what our international partners are also doing, for two reasons. One, to secure the competitiveness of our own sectors globally. But number two is that you retrieve at least part of the taxes or part of the revenue . Microphone, thank you. No, that's okay. No, that's fine. And so by having at least certain pricing for some sectors, but we need to think it through a bit more. But the advantage of that is that we would at least keep part of that revenue within the continent rather than having it collected, for instance, within the European Union. So my immediate reaction seeing this is, what is the impact on the industry? Is it, positive, negative? And I think we need to weigh those options much more carefully. And then what sectors are we specifically talking about? I think that being said, I think the question is, should we rather not be thinking of a phased approach? Perhaps a mix of these different scenarios that you introduced, Simon, to say, for the time being, a harmonized carbon price would be difficult because of some, across industries may be difficult. Because it's not just a matter of carbon price. I think there's an entire the entire mechanics behind that are important. How do we account for emissions? Very practical question I've been dealing with this year because of the work we were doing on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where we were speaking to some of the Mozambican aluminium industry, saying, well, we cannot account for how much emissions we are using because we're relying on the regional power pool, which has a mix of green and coal. And so I think that groundwork, before we even start speaking of carbon pricing and then accounting for emissions, that groundwork needs to be done. We will need to do it anyway because of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So maybe there's a twin kind of approach there to develop the capacity and maybe pave the way for the introduction of the carbon market, the carbon price. Yeah, so just to say, I think the phased approach, I think we need to consider it based on the needs, but also based on the impact on industries. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatan. Very, very important points already raised. So now I will go to Rashid. I will follow the same order. And Rashid, you can introduce yourself briefly and then respond or react to the presentation overall in the spirit of exactly what the findings are and the balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Melaku, a question that given that the time, do you plan to finish by 10:30? What time do we plan to conclude? 10:30? Yeah, so which means we will not have 2-3 rounds, so I can speak very wide. Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm trying to get used to a bit of this mic. I don't know whether you can hear, but I can hear a lot of echo. So I can hear myself. And I love to hear myself, but it's a bit resonating as well. So thank you very much, Melaku, for this opportunity. My name is Rashid Kokab. I am working for an NGO called International Institute for Sustainable Development, IIST. I am Senior Specialist on Trade and Sustainable Development. I have been working on trade, development, environment issues at the international level since 1995 as a Pakistani diplomat in Geneva. And my association with Africa started in 1998 when I joined South Center, and I had the honor of working with Malimu Nairere. That was also the year when I visited Africa for the first time. And in that long period of almost 25 years, I have worked with a lot of African colleagues at the South Center, then as head of CUTS Geneva, and wonderful to see one of my CUTS colleagues sitting right in front of me. I taught at TRAPCA and also worked on trade and climate change issues in the context of Eastern Africa through a project from 2011. First, my quick comments about the study. So I must commend Melaku and Simon. I read that draft that you shared and then this presentation. As always, an excellent work. And my main points from there, first, I am quite encouraged and about what I would call the positive tone of the study and the outcomes, which show that trade promotion and climate action is not a zero-sum game. It is not an either-or relationship. It's not that to have climate protection, we have to stop trade. I think the message to me that is coming out very clearly, that we have also been saying that it does not have to be like that. Both can and should go hand in hand. And that's where in this relationship, of course, trade actually, I believe, can even contribute. For example, when it comes to adaptation, very briefly, with the climate change, the agriculture production patterns changing across regions due to the different climates can raise food security issues, and trade is a part of a solution there. But even in emissions, it's not a linear function. It is not that more trade means more emissions. That is a function of what and how of production and trade. What is being produced? How is being traded? Give a very stylized example, which I think is relevant for the study as well. For production, a key input, energy. And as Simon showed in this study as well, that in Africa, the share of renewables in the energy mix is going to increase. So a key component of production, energy, is not going to be so emission intensive. When it comes to trade, transportation and infrastructure play a big role. With better roads, rail connections, better, less emitting vehicles, more simpler and streamlined processes at borders, with that, actually, the emissions can be lower than more. And finally, it depends whether we are talking about goods and or services, and also the digital transformation, that will have much less emissions than the physical way of trading. So we have to take all these into account, but that is not to say that there is no tension. There is, of course, a tension between trade and climate action as well. And that's why, again, this study, I commend it. It clarifies that relationship in the context of AFCFTA and the African Action on Climate Change. In that tension, of course, so far we have not seen any trade dispute. Faf and I were talking just a little while ago, but we cannot rule that out. So far, to the best of my knowledge, while the climate action and trade action at the national level, governments are trying to address that more holistically. We are seeing that. Similarly, in regional integration initiatives, that is happening. However, so far, in no FTA, free trade agreement among developing countries, I may be wrong, but I have not seen any rights and obligations, any binding rules that link trade and climate change. There are discussions going on, but no binding rules and rights and obligations to the best of my knowledge. However, that may not remain so. Why? Because there is one area clearly which is at the interface of trade and climate change, which may have to be addressed through trade rules and agreements. And that is the issue of taxing based on carbon content, whatever name we give, when there is some action taken to protect the climate at the borders, that clearly falls into the trade domain and will have to be addressed. Of course, Swafan talked about CBAM, which is a reality now. EU has started implementing it. Of course, the actual action will come in 2026. And also, we are seeing similar initiative at various stages of consultation and development by a number of other countries. So something happening at the border looks likely. How to deal with that? And that's why, again, I must commend this study, the issue of carbon pricing. Can carbon markets and carbon prices of various forms be considered by developing countries, by African countries, because that can be a way to address what is going to happen at the borders. Of course, having said that and realizing the importance of carbon pricing, the devil is in the details. It's not easy. If we go to the most cited example of EU ETS and look at the years, the decades that it took, it did not happen in one day, despite all the resources that the EU has. Of course, the second comers and the third comers and the fourth comers do not have to go through all those steps. That's where, again, I'm going to throw some recommendations and suggestions to Melaku and his wonderful team. So looking at these various experiences of taxing carbon and putting a price on carbon, what are the best practices? Can there be guidelines of best practices that can be generated? And I would argue that not taking any single model, but could there be menu of options? Countries like in Africa have different capacities, different emission intensity, different objective realities. So that's why I quite like, instead of taking up this IMF baseline of $25, but Simon, in your study, you talked about country specificities and coordinated approach. But of course, that will require a lot of work, and I'm sure Melaku and your team will be looking into that to look at that. Now, finally, just a couple of more points before I close. One is going back to the study and the scenarios. These are very clear, as I mentioned. I do believe that more work would be wonderful to deepen that analysis both horizontally and vertically. Looking at, for example, not just the increase in trade and GDP, but also poverty and employment. Looking at the youth bulge in developing countries, of course in Africa, all these wonderful younger people coming into the job market, and that is going to be critical to have jobs for them. And similarly, from this global to going into more country and sector specific to the extent possible, because that will be excellent for policymakers. So let me stop here, Milaku. I had many other points, but we are short of time, and if I get an opportunity to come back later, I'll be happy to say a few more words. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Rashid. I think you have covered a lot of the issues very well. Babajide, I'm coming to you. Given the time that we have, please introduce yourself, but also I would like to touch upon the issue of energy transition, green transition in Africa, and the role of the regional and multilateral financial institutions in assisting, in expediting the desire for Africa to have that green transition. Over to you, Babajide.
Right, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Babajide Shodepo. I'm with the Africa Export-Import Bank. I work on African Union issues, the AfCFTA issues, trade policy issues, and of course, I do have some background and experience working on the AfCFTA negotiations and the agreement. I think just to be, really precise. First of all, an observation about the study. I think one general observation that we can make is that regional integration interventions, particularly on the continent, is a net positive for the continent's climate interventions. So I'm sure it goes even beyond the AfCFTA. If we look at things that we are doing in terms of interventions to create regional markets, whether it is for carbon credit, whether it is for energy, those are all interventions that help bring the scale, help bring the competitiveness that can drive investments in the sector in a manner that makes some of the renewable energy financing more competitive and more bankable. So it's quite striking to me that we can make that broader argument about the continent's regional integration efforts more generally. To the specific question of energy transition and the role that multilateral financial institutions play, I think, from the start, we should be clear that, at least in our view, as Afreximbank, as well as a number of other African multilateral financial institutions active in the sector, we look at energy transition in a much more holistic manner. It's in a much more holistic manner in the sense that, when you're talking about transition, you're not talking about, you still have to accommodate investments in areas and in sectors that still form the basis of a lot of countries' productivity, a lot of countries' economic development, a lot of countries' access to energy, and so on. So you will note that certainly some aspects of oil and gas financing, these are some of the projects where even within our broader portfolio, we see these investments as being critical in enabling the continent to transition properly over a certain period of time. And it is to that extent that the Africa Export-Import Bank is working with a number of countries to establish the Africa Energy Bank, or Africa Energy Transition Bank, which is going to be a financial institution, a multilateral financial institution that will be capacitated, that will be financed specifically to be able to put together the range of tools and the range of interventions that are necessary to finance the sector. Because you will note that sometimes you do need really specific financing tools. You need really adaptive or adapted financial intervention tools to be able to make financing in the sector possible. Then the second point, in terms of our experience in terms of energy transition, is that even though we hear quite a lot about financing being available, we do not see that much action in terms of financing on the ground, right? So we know that there are these huge, envelopes and pots of money out there, but when we look at the actual financing that we're able to do for specific projects, it's on a much, much, much limited scale, whereby what you may find will be really a $5 million project here, a $7 million project here. If you're able to do a $30 million project, you feel like you've done something great. But if you're really talking about the continent's energy needs and deals, we need to be talking about projects in the hundreds of millions. And one key challenge that we have faced is with regards to the bankability of projects and the need for project preparation. So that is why, even as Afrexim Bank, a lot of our interventions, a lot of our financing is going towards supporting project preparation, which essentially looks at doing all the studies, doing all the feasibilities, looking at all the options for structuring and putting together the project in a manner that will actually make sense. For climate financing, energy financing, we must move beyond a model that thinks it has to be about grants to a model that looks at making projects viable, meaning they're able to generate returns, which will apply private sector money, which will apply money, which will attract money from the markets. And it is until we reach that, that inflection point, then we will begin to see the kind of transformative investments that are necessary on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Babajide. I think these are very well considered points about the role of the institutions, but also the gap between the rhetoric about the availability of finance on the one hand versus its actual delivery. So given the short time that we have, I am tempted to invite colleagues, if there is any one or two people with a burning question, please come in and ask a question in not more than 1 minute, please, so that our panelists can intervene. And I would also like to give a chance to Simo to say a few words on some of the points that have been raised. A number of issues have already come up. So maximum 2 people, my sister here and here. Yes, okay. So please.
Thank
you
so
introduce
much.
yourself and then put your question straight, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Marta Bekala. I work for development initiatives. I came in after this presentation, and what I see is carbon markets as the biggest opportunity that we're seeing under AFCFTA. And my question is, okay, carbon markets, but the economic benefit of that. But we are hearing reports of displaced indigenous people. We tend to focus on market solutions for a global public good. As we know, with the little economics background any of us have, market solutions do not necessarily work for GPGs. And when it comes to carbon markets, the do no harm principle doesn't seem to be followed. It has its own damages on communities. So I wonder if the role of the Safety Secretariat, for instance, or in the agreements that we have these social contracts stated clearly, and that there will be guidance on doing no harm when we are championing carbon markets.
Thank you very much. Here, please. Thank you. If you also introduce yourself and put your question across.
My name is Jeffrey Mkwada. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Mkwada. I'm on this Zimbabwean delegation, but I'm based in South Africa, where I'm working at the University of the Free State. And I'm doing some research in the mountains. And this research is about capturing data on different variables. What I am trying to drive at is that I think we have got a lot being done already on carbon pricing and all the other things. But what Africa basically lacks is a spatial data infrastructure. We do not have the data even to monitor the various changes that are happening in the environment and to correlate that kind of data with the actual needs of the continent. This is where I think we are lacking, and we are lagging behind. To a very large extent, we are relying on grid data, model data, and which is just interpolated from models. Is there something that is being done also to look at investment within the context of looking for systems that collect information on the continent so that we base whatever we do on informed decisions?
Thank you very much. So, I think we are good. So I'm now going to come back to the panel, and I will give you very maximum 2 minutes. I think Fatan, you made very, very important points earlier when you described our research as a hard nut to crack. I think that's how you put it. There is a lot of trade-offs involved here, clearly. There is a lot of room for diplomacy. We need to find that balance between these two competing interests. Of course, as Rashid put it very well, we are no longer talking about trade and climate change as if they are always clashing, always one undermining the other. In fact, in many cases, more trade can provide good opportunities for the climate change because of scale, because of the opportunity to diffuse technology, etc., etc. But Fatan, if you'd like to just take a couple of minutes, you can comment on the two questions as well if you wish. But I would like you to particularly focus on the issue of the trade-offs and the balances that we are trying to strike in Africa, taking into account Africa's development challenges that are also critical. Often we talk about climate change as an existential challenge, but poverty is an equally existential challenge and probably a more immediate one than anything else. So I just wanted to say a few things on that.
Thank you, Melaku. Perhaps just before I get there, respond to the 2 points. The point on data is a critical one, and I think that's why, I don't know if you were here when I did my intervention. I think we cannot speak of carbon pricing and emission and link that to emission accounting without having that particular data. So I think there's an entire infrastructure that we are still to build in all of our countries in a way that make it work, and we're still not quite there. So I think quite a lot of work and investment and thinking will need to go to go into that. And that links to the first question around, around the concerns around the integrity of the carbon markets. Because, I mean, as you know, even within the climate space, there are concerns on whether there is a false climate solution. And so unless we have that data, and this is why I think Africa can in fact be even a leader to avoid greenwashing, to perhaps take our time, but be very clear on what we are actually doing and how we're mitigating it. I think to go back to your question, Melaku, I think this question of trade-off is a very important one. I think the truth of the matter is that we're squeezed in terms of our international trade versus our developmental needs internally, which I believe we can only take the next step through industrialization. And so that's why in my comments I was really emphasizing on the protection of the industrial base and rather supporting it to grow and innovate, because at the end of the day, it's, industry is also jobs, and I think when we grow that's what we need to pay attention to. But we need to ease the industry into a green model through things such as investments in green energy, which is lagging still. And I think the colleague from Afreximbank raised quite a number of challenges there. So the challenge for us really is how do we ease our industries and even create new industries, which, by the way, through the CFTA can be done. We've spoken here a lot about, the carbon pricing, etc., but there are other methods through the CFTA or through, for instance, arrangements such as COMESA, where we also create a new green industry in Africa on for instance, solar panels, which there's a huge appetite for that within the African market, and we link that to the demand. South Africa this year imported more solar panels from China than anywhere else, while they do have a local manufacturing capacity, but not at scale. And so the challenge is how do we also use the CFTA? Perhaps with the CFTA, the challenge relates to standards in trading, but maybe we look at arrangements whereby CFTA can facilitate mutual recognition of standards within among countries. So there's an entire green economy that we can also create while we try to crack this nut of how do we deal with the carbon pricing issue and stimulate. But my point, just to conclude, is how do we incentivize in a realistic way while conserving and even growing the industrial base, incentivize them into a green economy rather than adding a layer of regulation on that.
Thank you very much, Fatan. Rashid, I'm going to come to you. You have lived much of your life as a diplomat, representing your own country in trade negotiations, and since you have been working in a think tank in which the trade and environment interface have been there, and you have seen the challenge, the evolution of the debate, of the negotiations between these two communities who don't necessarily even talk to each other, who don't even share the same vocabulary, the trade community and the environment community. You are sitting in Geneva. Tell us what Africa, can learn from, or where Africa is in that evolving debate between the trade and environment, in the search, as you rightly put it earlier, in the search for some kind of binding language down the road.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Melaku. And I think, first, very briefly, the questions that came, I think Fafan had addressed them quite well. My only comment to that will be, Martha, that yes, I totally take it and do not believe that carbon pricing will solve all the problems. Certainly not. And then again, and this is a matter we have been saying for a long time in cuts as well, that trade should be a means to an end. Trade itself is not an end. So similarly, whatever actions, policies are taken, we have to look at the inclusive development of the people, and that is the overall objective. Having said that, now coming to quickly about my own life and trying to find dialogues and accommodations across various constituencies, and I like to call that diplomacy is the art and science of communicating and understanding each other with a view to finding common ground and solutions. And that takes place at several levels. That takes a lot of effort. And I'm very pleased to say that in that international setting, in my long life there now for almost 30 years, I have seen African voice getting stronger and stronger. And that is a reality. I can tell you a real incident. It was 1999. I was at the WTO Ministerial Conference in Seattle, where many African delegates were not being allowed to go into closed-door meetings. And Zimbabwe minister, trade minister, who was the coordinator of Africa group at that time, he had a press conference and I was there. So he said something very powerful and very sarcastic. He said, oh, in those rooms, our hair are being combed while we are not being allowed to be there. And I can say that now Africa's voice and knowledge is power, means that voice is being heard much more. That's what I sense in Geneva as well. And Africa can be the leader of developing countries, can work towards compromises. And in that, my final point, and I was quite touched by something that happened. Being a diplomat, dealing with the negotiation day in and day out, means one develops certain specialization, but also, I guess, certain blind spots. So when I landed here yesterday morning from the airport to my hotel, I was in a hotel shuttle, and there were a teacher from Argentina and a teacher from Madagascar with a couple of students each. And we started chatting. It transpired that they were part of a program, 70 plus countries, bringing teachers, one teacher with 1 or 2 students. And it was very good to talk to them, one from Argentina, another from Madagascar, and they were saying, look, our students are going to tell their stories of climate change, which are different. It is happening, but how to respond to that, what are they actually experiencing is not the same. So these children are coming and they will tell each other their climate change stories and what should be done. And that to me was a very powerful message that one, we can learn from these children, and actually I would say we should go, and that is my plan also today afternoon, to go and hear their stories. And I would say that in climate change we are talking about our future, and I would like the lead diplomacy to be taken by these potential leaders of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rashid. Jide, I'm going to come to you now for a very short intervention. As somebody who negotiated, who played a very instrumental role in putting together the AFCFTA, and now working with the bank, and you got the question earlier, for example, that no, the market approach is not necessarily what works. What would you say to that? What is the role of, how do we bring, the financing issues that you brought out earlier? You were very clear that we need to move to grants rather than looking for bankable projects on profit basis alone, which is kind of going away from the market approach as well, I think. So what would be your advice, for example, in Africa's efforts to pursue these two parallel but important and overlapping kind of policy goals? Over to you, Jide.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah. So what I would say is that, of course, markets cannot solve every problem, but then there are some situations that it is only markets that can work, right? So if you look at if you look at the question, you need to generate a lot of investment, a lot of resources.
5 minutes.
You have very limited options. One, you could either use public money, which means you just essentially tax the citizens, right? But if you look at the amount of tax you have to raise from your already, not very well-to-do citizens, compared to the amount of resources you need to invest, it will be very clear very early on that you cannot do all of that, or the public sector by itself cannot carry all of that weight. So to the extent that you are trying to generate some private investment, then inevitably private investment is looking for returns, then there has to be some kind of market-driven solution. And I think what has even become clear is that when it comes to Africa's problems, the era of waiting for some kind of aid, some kind of handout, some kind of, I think nobody's really expecting that to work anymore, right? So you must find these resources in some way. But on the other hand, of course, it's not, the markets cannot be blind. It does need some kind of guidance, some kind of steadying. And that is where the government can play a much more active and a much more deliberate and informed role. Thank you.
Thank you, Jide. We are running out of time. I will give 2 minutes to Simon to give a few reactions to some of the questions, please.
Thank you, Melaku. I saw the pressure that you got to close quickly, so I'll not respond to every single question, although I would want to. But just to thank very much the three panelists and also everyone in the room. Because, Madam, you mentioned the AFCFTA Secretariat, I also wanted to jump in and say that it has to be very clear that there is no mandate today to negotiate environmental issues within the AFCFTA framework. This has to come from the member states to decide whether they want to do it or so. So it was just to get this out of the way. Faten, you raised very important issues, and I wanted to react to those because I think the questions have already been answered by you, and so I will not come back on them. But just to say that, yes, so for the carbon pricing, the $25, we use a price economy-wide, so we apply the same to all countries and all the sectors. That I understand that it's quite a simple approach. And it does have a negative impact. That's what we are showing. But we are showing a small impact because we looked at it in the context of the AFCFTA. And the AFCFTA is creating economic benefits. And so the negative impact are diluted within the AFCFTA context. We didn't look at the effect of carbon pricing without the AFCFTA reform. This is possibly what we could also do to really assess what's the negative impact from the carbon pricing. And then, again, this is really to start the conversation. We are not saying that what we have done is an optimum way to look at carbon pricing, but it was really to throw the ideas on the table and see what it means. And then after, I think there is scope to refine moving forward, differentiated price across industries, across countries possibly. This is something that can be done. And then last point, I know we don't have time, but just to say that Rashid, you raised an important point, Madam, too, about the social impacts of carbon pricing, and you also say that it may be good to look at poverty and employment implication. We did that in the context of the AFCFTA alone. Maybe moving forward, we can also do it in the AFCFTA plus climate policies. So that's all I would say. Thank you.
Colleagues, we are run out of time, so please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you very much. Okay. And most importantly, let me also thank Simo for an excellent presentation, for responding, and to all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.